Frank Miller returned to Red Maple Ridge expecting peace, and found train tracks slicing through his cornfield instead. The morning haze was just beginning to lift when Frank stepped out onto the wide front porch of his farmhouse, coffee mug warming his hands. Cicadas hummed in waves from the tree line. The scent of late summer dew and distant hay clung to the air. He let out a slow breath and took a sip. His mug, white ceramic with a blue faded print that read County Fair 1987, had been chipped for over a decade, but it still held heat like nothing else. 3 weeks earlier, he'd left this porch in a rush to help his daughter recover from gallbladder surgery in Georgia. Now, back home, he expected the same golden quiet he'd always known. Instead, the silence felt off, hollow. Frank's boots crunched over gravel as he crossed the driveway and made his way toward the eastern field. Just beyond the chicken coop, a row of corn stalks gave way to an unfamiliar glint, something metallic catching the sun. He stopped short, his hand lowered slowly from the brim of his cap. 2 parallel rails cut clean through his sweet corn rows, slicing his soil like a surgeon's blade. Wood ties, crushed plants, and decorative lights dotted the path like it had always been there. It hadn't. The red and white train car sat parked about 20 yards away, still and gleaming. Across its side, painted in neat block lettering, Heritage Line, a Pine Hollow, proud project. Frank stood still for a long time. The wind tugged gently at his shirt, but he didn't move. He traced the line of destruction with his eyes, his best topsoil, ruined. Corn bent sideways, roots exposed like snapped bones. A fury began to burn low in his chest. He walked back toward the house, entered the mudroom, and flipped through the pile of mail still sitting in the metal tray near the door. Nothing from the county, nothing from Pine Hollow, nothing marked certified. He didn't bother changing his shirt before heading into town. By the time he pulled into the HOA's office parking lot, the air was thick and buzzing. He could see Rebecca Winters through the glass doors, tapping away at her laptop. She stood when he entered, always the polished one, with her navy blazer, pearl earrings, and sharp hair. Frank noticed the laminated brochures lined neatly along the welcome desk. One of them showed a smiling couple boarding the Heritage Line with a corny tagline, "Ride through history, right in your backyard." "Well, Mr. Miller," Rebecca said, her tone cool and rehearsed, "I was wondering when we'd see you again." Frank didn't smile. "You want to explain what that thing is doing on my property?" She tilted her head. "Surely you received the certified notice while you were away. Section 14 of the county ordinance permits temporary public works easements under community redevelopment." "I didn't get a thing," Frank said, voice flat. "And there's nothing temporary about that train." From a side office, Richard Thompson appeared, still tall for his age, with slicked-back white hair and the calm demeanor of a man who hadn't seen a courtroom in decades but liked to pretend he still owned one. "Ah, Mr. Miller," Thompson said. "We assumed you'd have questions. This letter here," he pulled a folded paper from a manila folder, "was sent 3 days after the August board meeting. Certified mail." "I was gone taking care of my daughter," Frank said. Thompson gave a tight smile. "We figured as much. That's why we expedited the project. Construction crews had an opening, and frankly, well, the community's been waiting a long time for something like this." Frank didn't blink. "You didn't have my permission." Rebecca stepped in again. "We don't need your permission, Mr. Miller. The eastern portion of your land falls within an administrative overlay zone. The ordinance predates your ownership, 1979, I believe. This train adds value. To all of us?" Frank looked at the papers but didn't touch them. She reached into the folder again and slid a check across the table. $300, she said. "Market value for the corn lost. It's really a generous offer, all things considered." He stared at the check. $300 wouldn't even cover the fuel he'd spent tilling that soil, let alone seeds, labor, or lost revenue. Rebecca leaned back, arms crossed. "You should thank us, Mr. Miller. Your eyesore of a field just increased everyone's property values." Frank picked up the check, held it for a second, and then tore it slowly down the middle. He turned without another word, walked to the door, and paused as the sun spilled into the room. "Not if it's not your land to build on." In the barn's loft, Frank opened a rusted file cabinet and found the past, a yellowed survey map marked Northeast Corner Dispute, 1968. Rain tapped against the tin roof like a patient metronome, steady and unhurried. The barn smelled of sawdust, old rope, and motor oil. Comforting, in a way that only things untouched by time can be. Frank stood beneath the exposed rafters, a single bulb swinging slightly overhead. He'd pulled the old metal cabinet out from beneath tarps and tools, its drawers stiff with age, its corners scuffed and flaking. But what it held, that still had value. Rebecca's smug voice lingered like a thorn under his skin. "We've got the permits. Do you have the willpower?" The storm outside rattled the windows as Frank laid the survey map flat across his grandfather's oak work table. His fingers followed the ink lines and pencil markings, faded but legible. Every inch of their land hand-documented, annotated in his grandfather's slanted cursive. There, circled in red, was a note that made Frank still. Northeast boundary disputed, 1968. County error. No recorded transfer. Flag for future correction. He exhaled slowly. His grandfather had found this issue decades ago and never pursued it. Maybe back then it didn't matter, a scrap of woodland on the edge of nowhere. But now it mattered more than anything. Frank dug deeper into the cabinet, pulling out a folder labeled Easement, Water Lines, 1968. Inside was a typed letter from the county confirming the surveyor's mistake. Attached, a carbon copy of the original plat map, the land in question still shaded as part of the Miller property. He stared at it for a long time. Even now, years after his grandfather passed, Frank could hear the man's gravelly voice. "They'll come after it one day. Not 'cause they need it, but because they can't stand someone else holding on." Frank set the papers aside and reached for his cell phone. He scrolled to Sam Jenkins, old friend, neighbor, and the only lawyer he trusted, and hit call. The rain muffled most other sounds as the line rang. "Frank?" Sam's voice came warm and alert. "I've got something," Frank said. "You remember that weird corner they built their office on?" "You mean where the Heritage Center sits?" "Yeah, it's not theirs." Frank explained, quick but detailed. The map, the folder, the documentation his grandfather had tucked away and labeled like a man expecting war, even in peacetime. Sam didn't speak for several seconds. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said at last. When Sam arrived, the barn was glowing with lamplight and tension. He flipped through the files, eyebrows rising with each page. "This is gold," he muttered. "Real gold, Frank. You're sitting on a decades-old clerical screw-up that the HOA never caught." "So that office?" "Legally," Sam said, "it's sitting on your land. And unless they did a title search that goes back to 1940, which I doubt, they've got nothing." Frank nodded once. "Then let's make it official." They spent the next hour scanning documents, sending encrypted files to the county assessor's office, and prepping for a formal survey request. Sam promised to call in a favor with a clerk he knew from his days on the zoning board. But Frank wasn't done. The next morning, with the rain now just a memory on the leaves, he drove into Pine County and walked into the Environmental Board's office. A faded mural of birds in flight adorned the lobby wall. Behind the counter, a clerk named Maria Nguyen looked up from her screen. "Can I help you, sir?" Frank removed his cap and laid a folded form on the desk. "I'd like to register a wildlife sanctuary," he said. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "For parcel 1103A, he added. Maria typed, her brow lifted slightly. "Isn't that where the Pine Hollow HOA's building is?" "It might be," Frank said calmly. "But according to the original survey maps, and now a corrected boundary filing, it's mine." Maria stared at him for a moment longer, then slowly nodded. "We'll begin the process." That night the wind picked up again, but the sky remained clear. Frank sat by the fireplace, the form resting on his lap. He remembered a time when he was 10, walking that northeast corner with his grandfather, who had planted tiny oak saplings in a patch of loam. "For the birds," the old man had said. "This land belongs to them before it'll ever belong to Suits." Frank smiled quietly. He made a vow, silent but firm. This land would never belong to people who didn't respect it. Frank slid a form across the desk titled Application for Protected Wildlife Sanctuary, Parcel Number 1103A. Saturday dawns with fog and quiet resolve. Frank changes the locks on the HOA office, on land they didn't know they never owned. The mist hung low over Red Maple Ridge, a thin veil that softened the edges of barns and rooftops. Light barely broke through as Frank parked his pickup at the edge of the HOA clubhouse lot. The truck door closed with a solid thud, and the only other sound was the distant cooing of mourning doves from the trees. A canvas-wrapped banner sat in the bed of the truck, weighed down by a toolbox and a new set of brushed nickel locks. Frank walked across the gravel slowly, deliberately, as if each step marked the return of something stolen. The night before, he'd stood on his porch holding that banner, whispering into the breeze, "Let's see how much they love nature now." Now, as he unwrapped the sign and laid it across the building's front windows, the words stared back at him in bold green letters. Future home of Red Maple Ridge Wildlife Preserve. Deputy Dale arrived a few minutes later, pulling up in his cruiser. He stepped out, coffee in hand, and gave Frank a respectful nod. "You sure about this?" he asked, glancing at the building. Frank handed over the stamped papers from the county. "It's all there. Maria signed off last night. Survey's been corrected. Title filed, Dale took his time reading the documents. His brow lifted slightly. "Huh, never thought I'd see the day someone turned a HOA office into a sanctuary." Frank shrugged. "They turned my field into a theme park. I figured I'd return the favor with a little more grace." The locksmith, a wiry man named Jeff with a weathered face and quick fingers, arrived on schedule. Within 20 minutes, the old locks were out and new ones clicked into place. As he packed his tools, Frank began posting laminated sanctuary notices on each entryway, front door, back door, and even the loading dock behind the meeting room. By the time Maria Nguyen showed up with a clipboard and a curious smile, the sun had begun to burn through the mist. A few early risers walking their dogs paused to watch. One man raised a brow. "What's going on here?" Frank nodded politely. "Preserving some history," he said. "The right way this time." Maria walked the perimeter, confirming placement of signage and photographing each for the county record. Shortly before 9, a car pulled up fast, sleek and black, tires crunching over gravel. Rebecca stepped out in heels that sank slightly into the damp earth. Thompson followed close behind, tie askew and face flushed. "What on earth is this?" Rebecca barked, storming toward the entrance. She rattled the door handle. It didn't budge. Her key, when tried, turned nothing. Frank stood beside the sanctuary sign, arms crossed. "You changed the locks?" she demanded. "You can't just—" Deputy Dale stepped forward, calm as ever. "Ma'am, Mr. Miller is within his legal rights. County has updated the records. This structure sits entirely on his parcel." "This is a registered office," she snapped. "We conduct official HOA business here." "Not anymore," Frank said evenly. "It serves no HOA function. It belongs to the land now." Thompson stepped in, holding his phone. "We'll sue. This is trespassing. Vandalism. We had permits." "No," Frank said. "You had assumptions." Maria cleared her throat. "We've confirmed the registration. The signage complies with environmental code. The county accepted the status change last night." Rebecca's voice pitched higher. "You can't do this." Frank didn't blink. "You already did. I'm just restoring it." A murmur rippled behind them. More neighbors had gathered. Ellen stood near the curb, arms folded. A teenager pedaled by on a bike and gave a whoop when he saw the sign. One of the local kids clapped and shouted, "Go, Mr. Frank!" A photographer from the Ridgefield Sentinel crouched near a bush, snapping pictures. He zoomed in on the banner, then on Rebecca's furious expression. Thompson was already dialing someone, muttering about injunctions and emergency board sessions. Meanwhile, a neighbor named Dave ambled up and handed Frank a thermos. "Heard you'd be out here early," he said. "Brought the good roast." Frank accepted it with a quiet "thanks," then took a sip. Strong and steady, just the way he liked it. By mid-morning, the whispers had started. How much had the HOA really spent on that train? Who approved the budget? Had Rebecca gone rogue, or was the whole board complicit? Frank didn't answer questions. He didn't gloat. He simply stood next to the sign, sipping his coffee, letting the building speak for itself. The next day's front page. Landowner turns tables on HOA, wildlife versus bureaucracy. Rebecca arrived to lead Saturday inspections, but was greeted instead by a crowd and a locked office bearing a new sign. Protected Wildlife Sanctuary, authorized personnel only. The wind picked up just as she stepped out of her SUV, catching the edge of her blazer and pulling a strand of hair loose from her perfectly styled updo. The lot, once pristine and private, now had tire marks from news vans, boot prints in the soft dirt, and a row of onlookers standing across the street like spectators before a parade that had already started without her. She clicked across the pavement, heels stabbing into the gravel, lips pressed into a line. The familiar click of the keycard reader brought nothing. She tried again, still locked. Then her eyes landed on the sign, bold green letters across white aluminum. Protected Wildlife Sanctuary. Authorized personnel. Only. County Registry. Number 1, 103A. Behind her, someone chuckled under their breath. She turned sharply, but saw only Frank Miller standing beneath a maple tree with a mug in hand, calm as ever. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was hard to forget what she'd said at the HOA meeting 2 months ago, standing at the podium in front of the clubhouse's flag. "We are the gatekeepers of Pine Hollow's future." Now she was on the wrong side of the gate. Deputy Dale stood a few paces from the entrance, arms folded. She marched toward him. "Deputy," she barked, "why am I being locked out of my own building?" He remained steady. "That parcel has been confirmed as privately owned by Mr. Miller. Title correction was filed, survey approved. The designation as a sanctuary is legal and recorded." "That's not possible," she snapped. "This office has been the HOA's headquarters for years." "Turns out the original development missed a few inches," Deputy Dale said with a shrug. "More than a few, actually." Around them, whispers started rising like dry leaves in the wind. "Wait, this whole time the office wasn't even built on HOA land?" someone murmured. Ellen Green, arms crossed, looked around at her neighbors. If the land was never transferred, how did we get approval for the train project? And why wasn't that brought to a vote? Thompson stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "We had every intention of verifying the property line, but—" "But you didn't," Ellen said, cutting him off. "We've been paying dues for years, and suddenly we're financing a train no one asked for? Who approved the budget?" Frank still hadn't spoken. He leaned against the old utility box near the sidewalk, sipping from a thermos Dave Carlton had handed him earlier. The coffee was lukewarm now, but still smooth. Pastor Ellis ambled up beside the growing group, hands in his coat pockets. I do believe this is the Lord's way of reminding folks that pride goeth before a fall. Mrs. Marsh, retired school teacher and lifelong resident, raised her voice just enough to cut through the murmuring. I'd like to know how much of our HOA reserve fund was spent on lighting and benches that now sit on someone else's land. Rebecca's voice quivered. This isn't a courtroom. It's an inspection day. We're not having this conversation in the middle of the street. A reporter from the Ridgefield Sentinel stepped forward, recorder in hand. Would you like to give an official statement, Ms. Winters? The town seems eager for one. Rebecca turned, storming back toward her car, jaw clenched. Frank looked at her as she passed. Their eyes met briefly, but neither said a word. By late afternoon, Ellen sent out an email to all HOA members. Emergency meeting, 6:30 p.m., Green Residence Garage. The response was quick. Lawn chairs unfolded onto the concrete floor. Someone brought a folding table with pumpkin-patterned napkins. Mrs. Marsh placed a homemade apple pie at the center. Dave brought brownies. A few neighbors brought cider and wore jackets against the crisp air. It felt less like a meeting and more like a gathering of people who had been quiet for too long. Only half the board showed up. Rebecca did not. Ellen took the folding chair at the head of the table, glanced at the notes in her lap, and said, "Before we begin, I want to say one thing. I think we forgot who we're supposed to be serving." No one interrupted. No one defended the train. No one mentioned Rebecca. The evening ended with more questions than answers, but also with something else, resolve. Children played tag in the yard outside, darting past the wildlife sanctuary sign now visible from across the street. One of them pointed at it and laughed. That's the place where adults finally started acting right. Just before midnight, Rebecca pulled into her driveway and reached into the mailbox. A folded paper stuck out beneath a realtor flyer. She pulled it free and read the bold heading under the porch light. Motion for immediate resignation. HOA, President Rebecca Winters. Ellen knocked on Frank's door with a thermos and a proposal. Let's talk, not as neighbors in conflict, but as stewards of what we love. The sun cast long golden shadows across the porch planks as Frank opened the screen door. The November breeze had a chill to it, but the light was warm and full. Ellen Green stood on the other side, bundled in a gray wool coat, the thermos in one hand and a small jar of apple butter in the other. "Thought you might appreciate the good stuff," she said. Frank nodded and stepped aside. "Come on in." They sat on the porch steps, the sanctuary sign visible in the distance beyond the eastern field. Frank poured the coffee. It was strong, dark, and smooth. "I owe you an apology," Ellen said, cupping her mug. "Back in September, I said I didn't want to get involved. I just wanted peace. But I realized peace doesn't come from staying quiet." Frank listened without interrupting. He appreciated quiet more than speeches. "I've spoken with the other board members," she went on, "the ones who are still willing to listen. We'd like to find a way forward, one that doesn't involve courts or shouting matches. But we also know we have to earn back trust." Frank raised an eyebrow. "And that thermos is supposed to buy it?" Ellen laughed softly. "No, but maybe this will help." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. It was a written proposal, simple but clear. Frank read it twice. Then he looked up. "I have my own terms," he said. 3 of them. "Let's hear it." 1. The sanctuary remains off limits to development. That parcel stays protected, no matter who's running the board. Ellen nodded. 2. The HOA pays to restore the eastern field. That's not negotiable. Understood. And 3, you match every dollar of rent or event fee collected at the sanctuary with a donation to wildlife education, local kids, local programs. She didn't blink. Done. They shook hands. No lawyers, no threats, just the creak of the porch swing and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. Later that week, Ellen hosted a board meeting in her living room. The HOA was now down to 5 active members. No one mentioned Rebecca's name. Sam Jenkins joined by speakerphone to walk them through the formal terms. Frank stood near the fireplace while they voted, unanimous approval. Ellen handed him a pen. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, "but it's a start." Frank signed. The applause was soft but sincere. The next morning, neighbors began arriving with gloves, shovels, and trays of seedlings. Some brought casseroles. Others brought their kids. Frank stood near the edge of the eastern field, directing traffic like a conductor without a baton. Evelyn Marsh approached him with a notebook and a determined look. "I've been thinking," she said, "we've got kids who barely know what a cedar tree smells like. How about we run nature lessons here? Teach them what it means to take care of something that can't talk back." Frank nodded. "You'll need space and time." "I've got both," she said, then smiled. "Besides, I already recruited 3 retired teachers and 1 very eager Boy Scout troop." Maria Nguyen stopped by that afternoon with pamphlets from the county's Community Engagement Office. "We'd like to highlight this project in the winter newsletter," she said. "People could use some good news." By evening, Frank returned to the house and found an envelope on his porch bench. No return address, just his name in blocky handwriting. Inside was a short note on lined paper. "Thanks for standing up. You didn't just protect land, you protected dignity. VFW, Post 284. He folded the note and slid it into the back of his wallet. The next morning, as he walked the newly cleared path between his field and the sanctuary, the soil still smelled of promise. A child's voice called out from behind the trees. "This place feels like magic." Spring arrived with birdsong and shovels. 20 neighbors gathered to plant new life where a train once trespassed. The eastern field was no longer a scar. Where rails had once gleamed in defiance, rows of wildflowers now danced in the April breeze. Bluebells, black-eyed Susans, and milkweed pushed through the soil like they had always belonged. A cedar bench rested beneath the old oak tree Frank's grandfather had planted. The wood was smooth, the grain warm in the morning sun. Frank stood by the fence line, arms folded, wearing the same flannel shirt his grandfather used to wear. The sleeves were rolled just above his forearms, and the fabric still carried the faint scent of cedar oil and soil. Children crouched in groups, digging gently, placing seedlings into soft earth. Evelyn Marsh walked between them, a canvas satchel slung across her shoulder, pointing out different species of caterpillars and bees. "If you spot a monarch," she told them, "that's a sign we're doing it right." At the sanctuary's edge, the community garden had taken root. Raised beds lined with weathered planks now burst with spinach, kale, and early strawberries. One older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Benton, tended their plot side by side, hands moving in familiar rhythm. Frank didn't say much. He simply moved between people, checking in. A boy tugged at his sleeve, holding up a bird feather. Frank knelt and took a look. "Carolina wren," he said. "Loud little thing with a big attitude." The boy grinned and ran off to show his friends. Not far from the garden, a small plaque stood at the edge of a mulched pathway. It read, "Red Maple Ridge Wildlife Preserve, in honor of those who kept the ground steady." The train was gone. Its parts had been dismantled and donated to the local children's museum. The caboose, repainted in bright blues and greens, now served as an interactive exhibit about agriculture and conservation. Next to it, a brass plate read, "Reminder of what matters." Inside the modest town hall downtown, formerly a hardware store, the HOA now held its meetings. They met once a month, folding chairs in a circle, no longer concerned with mailbox paint colors, but with things like storm drainage and footpath repairs. Ellen presided calmly, often starting with a quote and ending with an invitation for coffee. Frank didn't attend most of the meetings, but when he did, he sat quietly near the back and listened. In late April, he received a letter from the town council inviting him to speak at the spring festival. Just a few words, they said. Something about the land, the people, the progress. The day of the festival was warm and clear. Children chased bubbles near the stage. Veterans from the local VFW handed out lemonade. A bluegrass trio played under the gazebo. Frank stepped up to the microphone in front of a modest crowd. He didn't hold notes. He didn't need them. Protecting land, he said, isn't about fences. It's about remembering who planted the seeds. That was all. And it was enough. As the festival wound down, Frank walked the path back toward the sanctuary. Laughter echoed from the garden beds. A group of school children sat beneath the oak tree, their hands dirty, their faces lit with discovery. Evelyn handed one of them a magnifying glass and pointed to a trail of ants weaving through moss. A red-tailed hawk circled slowly overhead, wings wide and steady. The air smelled of turned soil and lilac. Frank stood still, taking it in. There was no fanfare, no applause, just peace. The kind that came slowly, like spring. And in the background, the sound of children laughing and dirt being turned. The land, once marked by conflict, now blooms with quiet resilience, its soil nurtured by more than just rain. It holds the roots of community, memory, and resolve. Frank didn't win through force or fury, but by honoring what was planted long before him. In a world quick to pave over the past, his stand reminded everyone that some lines drawn in the dirt are sacred. Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with fists or fire, but with a garden. And where wild things grow, healing often follows,